Myanmar's first election in 5 years. 57 political parties, 4,800 candidates. No election in 56 of 330 townships. Young voters largely remain absent. Is the system favouring military rule?
Myanmar has begun its first nationwide election in nearly 5 years. Today marked the opening phase of a 3-stage general election, an event the military government says will return the country to democracy, but one that many inside and outside Myanmar are calling deeply flawed. This vote comes after years of turmoil. Remember, there was a military coup, there were mass protests and a civil war that is still raging across large parts of the country. So what exactly is happening and what's really at stake? This is the first time Myanmar has gone to the polls since 2020 November, when Aung San Suu Kyi, National League for Democracy, won a landslide victory. Just months later, the military seized power, jailed elected leaders and crushed pro-democracy protests, triggering a nationwide rebellion that has never fully stopped. This is the first time Myanmar has gone to polls since that part of 2020. Now, almost 5 years on, the Junta says that this election is part of a plan to restore a multi-party democratic system. Voting will happen in 3 phases, that is today, then on the 11th of January and the 25th of January. The polls shall cover 692 constituencies across the country. At the end of the process, a new parliament will be formed, which will then select a new president and government. However, the road to this election has been anything but normal. On paper, this looks like a competitive race. 57 political parties are taking part, with nearly 5,000 candidates contesting seats in the lower house, upper house, and state and regional parliaments. Additionally, more than 21,000 polling stations have been set up across the nation. To add to this, Myanmar has also introduced major changes. Firstly, a new mixed-member proportional voting system, and secondly, electronic voting machines. Both are being used for the very first time. Officials maintain overseas voters have already cast advance ballots at embassies and consulates, and international observers have arrived to monitor the polls. However, critics say that the numbers hide a much bigger problem. There will be no voting at all in 56 of Myanmar's 330 townships, officially because they are too unstable. In reality, that means a huge part of the country, particularly areas under opposition or ethnic armed control groups, are simply excluded. Even in many townships where voting is happening, not all constituencies are going to polls. Some estimates suggest as much as half the country may ultimately be left out of this election. That alone makes turnout extremely difficult to predict. And violence has not stopped. As voting began, there were reports of explosions, rocket attacks and airstrikes in multiple regions, reminders that Myanmar is still very much at war with itself. Additionally, many of the young people who led the massive protests against the 2021 coup have either fled the country, joined resistance groups, or chosen to boycott the election altogether. While a few first-time voters say that they are participating out of civic responsibility, analysts say youth turnout appears much lower than in the last election. In cities across Myanmar, residents report shorter lines, quieter polling stations, and limited enthusiasm. Although the voters are sharply divided, for many young people, this vote simply does not feel like a real choice. However, there are those who have gone out of their way to cast their votes. On that note, let's take a look at what the Burmese people have had to say about these polls.
ဆိုကြအခုရေကောက်ပွဲကိုဆိုကျွန်တော်တို့စိတ်ထဲမှာတော့မရှိနေဆိုကြဒီအခုတော့တရန်ထားလောက်မှပဲရေကောက်ပွဲရှိဆိုတော့ကျွန်တော်ဆိုကြတတိထားမင်းဆိုရ
ဒီရေကောက်ပွဲကတော့တိတ်ပြီးထူးခြားခြားဖြစ်လာမယ်လို့တော့မပြောပါဘူးသူတို့အာနာတီမြေအတွက်ပဲသူတို့စစ်ယူနီဖောင်းကနေဒီအချက်သားယူနီဖောင်းကိုပြောင်းပြီးတော့အဲ့လိုအာနာဆုပ်ကိုင်ဖို့အတွက်သူတို့ကဒီရေကောက်ပွဲကိုထပ်ပြီးလုပ်တယ်လို့ပဲကျွန်တော်တို့အဲ့လိုပဲမြင်ပါတယ်ရေကောက်ပွဲပြီးရင်လည်းဆက်ပြီးတော့ဘုံကျင်းတိုက်ခိုက်နေအောင်ပါပဲဒီရေကောက်ပွဲကကျွန်တော်တို့ဘာလို့ယူလာမလဲဆိုတော့ကျွန်တော်ရခိုင်တွေနေတော့ဘာမှထူးထူးခြားခြားဖြစ်လာမယ်လို့လည်းမထင်ပါဘူးညှော်လင့်တာတော့မဟုတ်ပါဘူးဒါပေမဲ့ဒီရေကောက်ပွဲကဘလို့ပဲဖြစ်ရေကောက်ပွဲပြီးသွားမယ်ဥစ္စာရေကောက်ပွဲပြီးရင်တွတ်တော်တွေပါတယ်ပေါ်လာမှာပေါ့တွတ်တော်ပေါ်တဲ့အချိန်ကျတော့ဒီတိုင်းပြည်ရဲ့ပြောင်းလဲတဲ့ခုများနည်းနည်းလေးများဖြစ်လာမလားပြီးတော့ဒီဘယ်လိုပြောလဲဒီပြည်ရင်းစစ်ပေါ့ပြည်ရင်းစစ်ပြပခါတွေအတွက်ခုထွက်ပေါင်းများဖြစ်မလားအဲ့လို
Amidst all this, perhaps the most controversial question is whether this election is designed to keep the military in power. Around 40 political parties have been banned, including Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy, which dominated elections in 2015 and 20. Suu Kyi herself remains in detention along with many senior party leaders under charges widely described as politically motivated. That leaves the military-aligned Union Solidarity and Development Party, or the USDP, as the strongest nationwide contender. The USDP is fielding candidates across the country and accounts for roughly 1/5 of all candidates, far more than any other party. Analysts say that the new phased voting system may also work in the junta's favour. By splitting the election into stages, authorities can adjust strategy if early results do not go their way. And a new law has raised the stakes even higher. Till now, more than 200 people have already been charged for opposing or disrupting the polls under legislation that carries severe penalties, including the death sentence. In the meantime, the United Nations has urged the international community to reject the vote outright. The UN's Special Rapporteur says an election held while civilians are being bombed, political leaders jailed and dissent criminalized cannot be legitimate. Western governments and human rights groups concur with the UN, calling the process neither free nor fair. Listen in.
5 years since the Myanmar military overturned the democratically elected government, the UK remains deeply concerned at the ongoing violence. The military must de-escalate and cease its violence, including airstrikes on civilians. Targeted attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure must stop. We strongly condemn the recent airstrike on a hospital in Rakhine State this month, which killed more than 30 civilians. The UK is clear. Any meaningful election requires an end to violence and dialogue amongst all parties concerned. And there are no indications that the planned elections will be perceived as free or fair. Elections under current circumstances risk provoking further violence and make a long-term solution more elusive. We stand in solidarity with the people of Myanmar and their desire for peaceful, inclusive and democratic future. We will keep the Myanmar crisis on.
The military junta, however, has rejected all of this criticism. Interestingly, after casting his own ballot, junta leader Min Aung Hlaing insisted that the election would be transparent and warned that refusing to vote meant rejecting progress towards democracy. What's important to remember is that this election is happening against the backdrop of one of Asia's worst humanitarian crises. The civil war has killed thousands, displaced millions, destroyed the economy, and left entire regions without basic services. A devastating earthquake earlier this year and cuts in international aid have only deepened the suffering of Myanmar. The military has lost and regained territory largely through heavy airstrikes backed by support from China and Russia. In the midst of this tumult, survival and not merely voting remains the priority for many civilians. Voting continues on the 11th of January and 25th of January, with results expected towards the end of the month. But with low turnout, banned parties, ongoing conflict and large areas excluded, few expect this election to bring real national reconciliation. For the junta, the vote may offer a path towards legitimacy. For its critics, it is political theatre staged under the shadow of guns, prisons and war. And for millions of people across Myanmar, the question remains whether this election changes anything at all.
Myanmar's first election in 5 years. 57 political parties, 4,800 candidates. No election in 56 of 330 townships. Young voters largely remain absent. Is the system favouring military rule?